Did my big wood shop restructuring back in July. I left a couple projects hanging mainly because I couldn't take a ton of time off from work, and the project of rearranging all this stuff in and of itself took long enough that I kind of had to get back to work. And because I like to live in a space I rearranged a little bit before I finalize it, because things you think you might have wanted or needed, you don't actually need, and things you didn't realize would be problems become problems. So when I first put this table here, I knew I eventually would want to raise it to the same height as my table saw, so that it's easier to work at. Right now you kind of have to hunch over it. And I also knew, like, now I just have all my stuff thrown under there. I wanted to make some compartments for wood storage in general, to utilize that space more. Another thing I'm going to do is I put this bay at the end of my torsion box outfeed table on my saw to store tools, which it is convenient for doing that, but it more so collects dust and then you can't see the tools. So that I put on after I made the torsion box, and this doesn't really need to be removable anymore that I have more space, so I'm going to take all of that off and move the legs over just to get rid of that bay. It also will make the space between these a little bit larger. And I do have a wood turning lathe that I had set up before that I haven't fully decided where I'm going to put it, so that's kind of like a secondary thing to the table and fixing this. But that is also something I'd like to do, and it's right now in between Christmas and New Year's, and I have a couple smaller projects going on, so it's a good time to tackle all this stuff before the bigger projects start up again. So the first thing I'm going to do is move all of this stuff out of the way and take these legs off this tabletop.
So if you're looking for a video teaching you how to build some sort of ultimate workbench, this is not going to be the video for you. If you're looking for a video that will teach you how to build a decent workbench for a small or particular space like I have, this is going to help you out, especially if, like myself, you do not already have something for holding down materials. So I took aspects of two popular style benches, the French Robot bench and then the English Nicholson bench, and I combined them to kind of make what I thought would work best for me without spending a ton of money on vices. I didn't want to put a lot of money into this bench because, like I've said a couple times, it will only work in this particular space, and eventually I would like to make something when I move into a more permanent spot. So I'm utilizing a board I already have on my lumber rack, which is secured to the wall already. If you're not building this off of something like a lumber rack, you could secure this to a wall using the studs. So what I did was I took a flat board and ran it from the top of my table saw, which is the ideal height I'm going for, leveled it off, and then I marked down on that ledger that's already attached to my lumber rack about 1 3/4 inches, which would account for the thickness of my tabletop. I just drew a straight mark there, and then I attached another ledger on top of the one that's already there, which unfortunately would have worked if it was just a couple inches lower. And I attached that initially with screws, and then I ended up putting a backer behind it because it overhung that ledger a little bit. And then I went and put some heavy duty 4-inch lag screws through the whole thing so it wouldn't move, and this is going to hold up the back of my bench. And like I said, you could easily do this on a wall, actually probably more easy than I had it with shimming out this ledger on my lumber rack. In order to find the height for my legs, I clamped another piece of wood to my ledger, which is where the legs will be cantilevering off of. again found level and then measured to the ground. And my wood shop is at a severe slope, so the legs in the back would be shorter than the legs in the front, but I'm going to be making them the same size and just shimming out the front so that if I do move this front piece can be reusable. The legs won't be two different sizes. And then I just cut a piece of 2x4, and those will be my legs. And the way I'm going to attach these is using big lap joints to rest that big front apron on, as well as the bottom will have bracing which will correspond to the floor. You could see there's a little log there that the rack sits on top of, and I'm just going to put some stretchers across there to make the bottom. So once I had all my marks, I just cut a piece for that bottom rail, and then I raised the blade on my radial arm saw. There's multiple ways you could do this, to just cut a bunch of curves in those 4x4s, and that is where all my lumber will sit. And this makes for a really sturdy, quick joint because the lumber sitting on top of that 4x4, and it can't bow and come across once it's all put together. It's substantially stronger than just using butt joints for applications like this, but you're also not spending a ton of time on a workbench. That's not necessarily your ultimate final workbench. Spending time making really intimate mortise and tenons. It's also kind of fun when you're making something that will make holding this stuff down to cut all of these and chisel out excess much easier once it's done, but it's something you don't have when you're working on it. Then that top piece is just two 2x6s that I actually just recently got that are really straight, and it's going to be the same process. They're just going to sit on this big lap on the top, and the whole thing will be covered with dog holes so that you'll have a ton of spots to put hold fast or clamps or dogs in the front of the workbench. And the workbench is going to be completely flush in the front, so you could utilize every surface of it for clamping, and you'll have a flat plane. There'll be no undulation in depth, which makes it extremely versatile. So I dry fit everything together, and I was just making sure that the planes were flush, that you could run your hand across the whole thing and there was nothing sticking out. And then I found center of all my pieces. Before I assemble this, I wanted to drill all my dog holes on my drill press so they were as true as possible. I don't have any sort of tool for drilling straight holes, not on a drill press. And these are going to be 3/4 inch holes, and I pretty much put them every 5 inches. That was kind of a rough number I originally found online that I was going to stick to. I've never used a workbench that had dog holes before, so I was kind of going with what I consider to be reputable sources online to kind of find out what was the sweet spot for how many to put on there. Now this is all dimensional lumber. I wasn't going to spend, because I had it on hand. You can build a bench like this out of solid maple or what have you, but since it's going to be connected to the wall, it's already going to be fairly strong, and I wasn't worried about using dimensional lumber for the front. So the top I'm using for this is a top that I already had that someone gave me. I actually have two of them. It's a solid maple edge grained top that is about 1.75 inches thick, and it's really wide. It's wider than you would probably use for most workbenches, which means you can't really reach across the whole piece. But I didn't want to cut it down because I could utilize the back of it for storing things. So I found center on that, and then that's what I used to mark all my dog holes. And I wanted to drill the dog holes in this before I put it together because it's easier to drill. I find stuff like this when you're not using your drill press, when you could use your feet to hold things. So all I did was I made this piece. I took a scrap piece of 2x4 and I drilled a bunch of 3/4 inch holes in it, the spacing I wanted, and then I was just clamped one side of that in. You could see I had pre-marked all the holes with a punch, and then I just lined up that bit in the hole and was able to drill them, and these came out really I don't think I haven't showed it yet, but I gauged them once they were done, and that line of dog holes is really straight, and they're also super perpendicular, so no complaints on how that worked. Now I'm going to put a link in the description on how I just figured out the layout for these holes. Like I said, I used someone else's advice because I have never used dog holes, and he kind of maps out where you should be putting them and how many you should be putting them, and it's a printout that you could print out and utilize in your shop when you're making this, so I'll put a link in the description to that. And then once I had all those holes drilled, I just glued this together, making sure that everything was square, of course. That's kind of the first step of life with woodworking. And then on the edge that is going to be on the right hand side, I wanted all of that to be perfectly flush so I could utilize that corner. So you could see that there's an overhang on the edge towards my wall, which is good because if you're planing, you don't want it close to that wall because you won't ever be able to finish your stroke. So I cantilevered everything off one edge but kept the edge towards my workshop perfectly square. Now in order to attach these to the wall, I'm going to be using some just 2x4 stretchers, and I'm going to be putting not necessarily structural mortise and tenons on each end, but more alignment mortise and tenons to connect them to that ledger that's already on the wall. And then this is the scene where I thought I was filming cutting the shoulders off my tenons, but I didn't. Pressing play became a little bit of a problem. In this video, I messed up a couple of times. So to cut the mortises in my legs, I used my router jig, and I have a video on my channel showing you how to make this jig. And then I dry fit everything together and checked for level, and the floor dips a good 3/4 of an inch here, so I'm going to end up putting a little shim on the bottom of that leg. But I wanted to dry fit everything together, and the nice thing about these mortise and tenons are, unlike butt joints where it's really hard to dry fit things together and make changes, with the mortise and tenons, even though they're not structural mortise and tenons, they're more alignment mortise and tenons, you could see how the whole piece fits together and I can make changes without it falling apart on me. So once I had everything square, I just transferred those marks onto the other leg. This is adding that 3/4 inch little shim to the bottom of that front corner. And I did it with just 2 screws so that if I ever do move this table and put it on a flat surface, I could take that shim off and everything will work out fine. And I'm cutting the mortise on this end. Now the legs are the same width as that ledger on the wall, so that's how I got all these measurements. That ledger is I think about 64 inches, so the legs are about 64 inches apart as well, and I did that because I wanted the one edge towards my table saw to be perfectly flush. And then once again fitting everything together, just making sure that everything's square. So in order to attach all these pieces, I cut a bunch of 45s, and those will go in all the corners. 45s are great for helping with racking, and since the table's so wide and it's up against a wall, I would have to rig up something pretty intense and able to be able to use clamps to pull those two pieces together. So the 45s are also going to help with the glue up, holding everything together while the glue in those mortise and tenons sets. And this is the part where I thought I was filming and I wasn't, so you could see I already have those two 45s in place, and I'm adding the front ones. And once these were in place, everything was really strong. So I ended up using a clamp and a pipe clamp to pull that leg together on either side to attach those 45s, but once everything was in place, I could remove those clamps. Then tying this whole thing together to make the legs sturdy was super simple because I already had that piece towards my lumber rack there. I just cut a bunch of 2x4s and attached them on either side. which made this really sturdy. Now, if you're putting this against the wall, you could just put another ledger lower on the wall and do the exact same thing. Building this off of an actual wall versus my lumber rack would be easier than the way I did it.
This is my finished frame, and the things I was really going for, this flush front, is exactly what I got. The whole thing's square, but even more importantly, and I'll put the camera down and shake it once I'm done talking, it is super rigid, super sturdy. It's only going to get more rigid when I put weight on the bottom, as well as throw the top on. So for the inside, my original plan was to compartmentalize this, probably put a vertical partition so I had two sides on it, and maybe even a horizontal one so I had 4 compartments to slide stuff in and out. But to be perfectly honest, I'm out of lumber, because the way I would have done that is put another ledger across here, and then another ledger across the legs, and then put more of these stretchers across and make another level. So I'm just not going to do that today. It might be something I regret down the line, but right now I'm pretty much putting sheet goods in here, and I could stack those without a problem, and sheet goods I go through fairly regularly, so I feel like the turnover of storing stuff here will be pretty quick. The only problem I had was I wanted this to be flush as well, and it's not, and that's just because the the red toolbox I have here sticks out just enough to push this away from the wall a little bit. I could notch this out, but I think for the time being, I'm going to keep it the way it is and see if I could get away with it the way it is, because I would prefer not to notch that out. And to attach the table, all I did in the 4 corners was drill some holes in those diagonals and then sink some screws into the top.
The last part of this video is going to be making the hook for the left hand side of the bench, and I had a fairly large piece of red oak stock left over from a project I did a couple years ago, so that is what I used for this. And I just kind of traced the shape. I couldn't really find dimensions online, so I just kind of traced the shape off of a photo I saw, and I cut a bunch of curves on the table saw to make this easier to cut out on my bandsaw, because my bandsaw is not great. It's better than having nothing, but cutting through this oak, it stalls out fairly easily. So with all those curves, it just made the process a lot quicker. Once I had that shape, I used a fairly abrasive grit on my belt sander. I used 40 grit and just kind of took those curves down to that Sharpie mark I had. And then once that was done, I actually ended up using a flap disc on an angle grinder to kind of create the curve a little bit better. I don't think I filmed that. And then I finished it off with my palm sander, my orbital sander, just to smooth it out. So since I've never used one of these hooks before, I originally wanted to attach it with dowels, but I decided to attach it with lag screws so that if I needed to change it or modify it or ever move it, it would be much easier to do. So I just pre-drilled some holes so those lag screws wouldn't split my wood, and then I was able to attach it right to the bench. So I started by pre-drilling because part of this goes into the maple, and you're not going to be able to put those lags in the maple by hand unless you pre-drill. And then I just stuck a screw in one of those holes to hold it in place while I put the rest in.
This is where I'm at the end of this video. You can see I put my hook at the end, and I filled all this up with sheet goods. It's mostly pieces of ply that someone just gave me, and I could kind of switch that around. I've also been utilizing the underneath spot for stuff like sawhorses and whatnot, which I use pretty frequently, but there's never really a great place to store them. So the other nice part is I did end up removing that piece off my table saw, and you could see if I slide a board over, it is just about at the perfect height to work as another outfeed table for my table saw. If this was too tall and these hit it, that really would have messed up my life. So this is the vise I have, which I'll probably end up putting on there just because since there is this lip here, this will actually fit on there. I'll have to shim it so it goes a little bit lower, but I could utilize this vise with the bench dogs until I figure out what I want to do with this end. And then the hook is nice because you could see if you have a board how that will slide in place. You could put holdfasts on here and work on the edge of this board. When I first started this, I honestly thought it was going to be a one-part video, but because I'm not using, this is essentially a viceless table, since I'm not using vices, I'm going to be making stuff like bench hooks and shooting boards to use in conjunction with this table. So I'm probably going to make a second part video that shows making accessories for this, how the vise works. I probably won't show mounting the vise because I wouldn't recommend ever buying or using that vise. It's not super great, but it is what I have. And then probably my next project I'll actually be using this, and I could show some footage of how the whole thing works in conjunction with the style I have set up.